praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition. It's time for the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, I'm Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for all of your support of GunGuyTV and for listening to this podcast. I have to give you an apology up front. I haven't actually produced a podcast episode in about a month and a half. It's been so crazy busy here, I just keep running out of time. So I'm grateful to be including this podcast, which, we're getting closer to podcast episode 100. It seems like every day. In this podcast, what I've done is taken an interview that I recently did with Sean Maloney from Second Call Defense and included the entire interview. Oftentimes I do these interviews, they're an hour and a half long, and then I'll end up editing them down to 30 minutes for consumption on YouTube in places where time constraints really are important. But it's quite common that people want to hear the entire interview unedited, and that's what I've done here, is I've turned it into a podcast. And I'm going to continue to do that with the interviews that I do, where the longer format interview is interesting enough to make it into a podcast so you can consume the entire thing on your way to work or on your way home or whatever. Now, I should remind you that this podcast is about an hour long typically, and the first half is available free on your favorite podcast player. We also generally post a copy on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute, the Utah Gun Exchange, and other places like that, Vimeo and so on, so that you can subscribe and consume it at any of those places as well. The second half is exclusively for members of GunGuyTV Crew. That's a subscription group that I've got, membership group. They have access to behind-the-scenes stuff, features that are coming up. They get to see those early. We do a special 2A conference for them every month where we have a guest that they can actually ask the guest questions themselves rather than having to go through me. There's lots of stuff that we do for GunGuyTV Crew. So if you would like to join GunGuyTV Crew for all of that stuff and a lot more, including exclusive videos, and I post something on GunGuyTV Crew pretty much every day, then I urge you to go to GunGuyTVCrew.com. All right, now we're going to talk with Sean Maloney from Second Call Defense. I would just let you know that I'm very thrilled to announce that Second Call Defense has become a sponsor of GunGuyTV. They've been actually the service I've used to protect me in case I ever have to defend myself with a weapon for quite some time, about 5 or 6 years. Now they've decided to actually sponsor the channel and sponsor the podcast. So I'm very grateful. There will be a link for Second Call Defense in the description as well. I urge you to check them out. They are an outstanding service, and one of the things that really makes them stand apart from insurance companies, because they're a foundation rather than insurance, is that once they've forwarded or fronted all that money for lawyers and bail and all that kind of stuff, you never pay that back. And that's not the case with insurance products. There's a big difference. You don't want to be on the hook for all of that money. All right, let's go talk to Sean. Sean, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it. You're the first person I've spoken to, actually had on the show, from a self-defense coverage company. So it's a joy to have you on. Thanks for coming on.
Well, I want to thank you for having me on. I've been excited. I've been watching you for years, actually. So I know a lot about you, and you probably don't know so much about me.
Well, that'll rot your brain, by the way, watching my videos, but I do appreciate the fact that you do it. And, full disclosure here, I've actually had Second Call Defense as my concealed carry and defense coverage for, 5 or 6 years or right around there. So I know your company fairly well. And I think the world of you guys. So I'm very grateful to have you on. But why don't you tell me about you and tell me about Second Call Defense? One of the things I'm aware of is the fact that we have a lot of brand new gun owners this last 2 or 3 years. They've just purchased guns like crazy. And then once again, we've set records in gun purchases. And I have a feeling there's folks out there that don't realize what happens if you actually defend yourself. So first, tell me a little bit about you, and then tell me something about Second Call Defense.
I've been a criminal defense attorney for going on 30 years, and I got involved with firearms, I would say probably 15 years ago, and I have been dedicating my practice to self-defense and to people who are forced to use firearms in self-defense probably for a little bit longer than that. I represent people with federal violations, with state violations of law, concealed carry, and then, of course, with Second Call Defense, anybody who is forced to use their firearm in self-defense. And it happens quite quite a bit more than people realize, because when you brandish a firearm or tell somebody I have a gun, you're actually using your firearm in self-defense. And that's why statistically, and I'm sure you're aware of this, anywhere between 500,000 and 3 million times a year, Americans use a firearm in self-defense. And people always ask me, why such a wide range? Well, the vast majority of people who brandish never call the police, never say anything. The incident's over, the bad guy runs away, and they reholster their gun and they say, woof, I'm glad I got out of that one, and they go on with their life.
And you can confirm this, please, Sean. It strikes me that one way or the other, you're going to have some legal battles ahead of you, aren't you?
Well, and Joel, you're right. I can tell you that the vast majority of our cases are brandishing cases. And some prosecutors in some states will pursue those just as vehemently as they'll, if someone pulled the trigger and shot somebody. Generally speaking, someone ends up getting charged with felonious assault, or something like that with a firearm, when truly those aren't the facts of the case. When you draw a firearm and display that and brandish that in self-defense, you're doing it because you have an affirmative defense of self-defense. But even though it's just pulling a firearm and saying, hey, leave me alone, or you don't want any, all of a sudden you get a phone call, you're charged with felonious assault, which could be 10 years in prison, $100,000 bond just to get you out.
Wow.
And really, that's kind of how second call defense started. I'm also a entering instructor. I've been teaching basic pistol for years, and a young gentleman, 22 years old, that I had just instructed about 2 months before that, got his concealed carry permit, was attacked, and he brandished. And he decided to drive to the police station because he was near the police station and lived there his whole life. And the true bad guy called and blamed our client for everything that the bad guy did. And so when my client jumped out of his truck to run into the police department to tell them what just happened, the police were rushing out of the side door to go get this kid, my client, for brandishing a firearm. And so I got a call at Friday evening, and the kid was in tears. I really didn't understand what he was talking about, but being a defense attorney, I said, if you've been arrested, hand the phone to a police officer, and that's what happened. And the police officer described what happened and that he had been charged with felonious assault. And so now it's probably 6 o'clock in the evening. He'll be in the Butler County, Ohio jail for the weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and he'll be out Monday morning. And I knew that he would be a changed person if he had to serve that time. And so his brand new bride with her brand new baby and I went door to door for hours until we collected $10,000 cash for a bond, and
Wow.
then and paid that. And what people don't realize is that bond money, Joel's gone. You don't get it back. In the state of Ohio and in most states, but Illinois and Kentucky are different. That you get your bond money back because you pay it to the clerk, but that's $10,000. He's out at that young age. So finally, we got everything to go away, and everything was dismissed. He lost his job because of the things that were in the paper. I tried to expunge it, but in Ohio, felony charges, even though he was acquitted and it never even proceeded to trial, can't be expunged for a year. So now he's out of work, interviewing for jobs, and having to tell each prospective employer why he was charged with felonious assault. And then
Even though he was never convicted of anything, just the fact that he was arrested and charged.
Exactly. And when at the end of this whole case, I said to myself, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be protection for people, because I was constantly representing concealed carry holders in the area, and most of them didn't have any money. And I'm the last person, truthfully, to turn somebody away that's been wronged, I think, especially with firearms and their constitutional rights, just because they don't have the money. And I wanted our second call of defense members to have everything that a client should have when he goes and sees an attorney. And that's essentially how we created second call defense.
Well, a couple of questions pop to mind just from what the story that you just told. One is, how often is it the case that he who calls the cops first wins? Because what you just described was this kid who was innocent, but the other guy called the cops first, and now they're after the kid. I mean, how important is it to be the first one to call the police?
Joel, that's a great question, because that's something that, as an attorney, that I've done for years, because what I've found and what I've realized, as generally speaking, in the vast majority of times, the person that makes the first telephone call wins, at least in the beginning. So I always encourage people, even though I don't want you talking to the police officer without an attorney present, But if you're forced to brandish your firearm, I always say you got to call the non-emergency hotline or number for the police if you know it. If not, dial 911 and explain to them what happened. And
whether you fired, that applies whether you actually fired a round or not, right? If you just drew the weapon and the bad guy runs away, are you saying you should still call the police even so?
Oh, absolutely, without exception, because you touched a firearm, you drew a firearm, and there's a couple things that happen. Somebody's in fear of death or serious bodily injury or harm when that firearm's out of the holster pointing at somebody. And number two, you can be convicted of felonious assault for the actions of pointing a firearm at somebody if they decide that you didn't do it in self-defense. So when you're facing felony charges, years in jail, and a lot of money out of your pocket, you want to make sure that you make the first phone call to the police, explain to them what happened, and then if you remember, call second call defense, and where an attorney is going to be available 24 hours a day to take care of everything for you from the beginning. And like I said, kind of do it on a regular basis, far more than people would realize.
I'll be back with more from Sean Maloney in just a moment. Crimson Trace is one of my favorite companies. In fact, I have Crimson Trace laser grips on all of my carry and home defense guns. There are a lot of reasons why I recommend Crimson Trace, but one big one is the way it affects me personally. As I've gotten older, it has become harder for me to focus on the pistol's front sight, and at the same time, my night vision has gotten a bit worse every year. In my experience, that laser helps me get on target much faster. When combined with a light, it allows me to identify the threat and then get on target to deal with it with incredible ease and efficiency. So if you've been thinking about lasers and weapons lights, check out Crimson Trace. You'll find a link in the description and on my website. And don't forget to use the code GunGuy10 to save 10% on all of your purchases with Crimson Trace.
The opinions expressed by the Gun Guy are always right, unless they're wrong.
There's a pretty good bet that if you're in any kind of suburban area, metropolitan area, or anything like that, and you have to draw a firearm to defend yourself, you're on video, you're on somebody's. How important is your demeanor when you are defending yourself in these instances? How important is it what you say or how you say it? Do those things come back to bite people?
More often than not, they do come back to bite people. And that's one of the biggest problems is you want to make sure that you need to speak, but you want to make sure that you practice what you're going to say. You don't give them too much information because at that point in time with the psychological and physical aspects of a threatening encounter, you're really not in control of what you're saying anyhow. But it's very important, your demeanor and what you say. And in the case that I described to you at the beginning, what saved us were when he pulled over and was basically forced off the road by the guy that he brandished against, he was in a car wash parking lot. And as I walked out for his initial appearance, I started thinking to myself, I had a trial advocacy professor back in 1991 when I was a third-year law student who said, remember, you're always on film. And I remember him saying that as I walked out of the courtroom. So I drove to the place where the incident occurred. I went inside and there was a nice female behind the counter. And I introduced myself and asked her if there were any cameras. She says, I have lots of them. I said, could I have a copy? I explained to her what happened and asked her if I could have a copy of Friday from about 4:30 to 6 p.m. She said, sure. She downloaded it right then. She handed me back then a CD. And everything happened exactly the way my client said it happened. And so that went a long ways in the charges being dropped, but it could just as easily go the other direction. And so it's very important of how clear you are when you speak to the police, and then and how you handle the self-defense situation. I mean, they're down and dirty, bloody and dirty and nasty sometimes, but you still want to come off as the good person with the firearm.
Does this just apply to, we have a ton of new firearms owners around the country. It's just millions and millions of them. Many of them, and then we're also seeing the applications for concealed carry permits picking up a lot. Even in the state of California, I think of the 58 counties we have here, 55, I think, issue a lot of permits. And people don't believe that in California. I've had a permit in California for about 30 years. But we have a lot more people getting those permits. So we tend to focus on those. But does this kind of situation just apply to concealed carry and defending yourself in that kind of public scenario, or does it apply when you're in your house and home as well?
That's another great question. And believe it or not, and I was shocked to learn this, that we as concealed carry holders and firearms owners, we use self-defense in the home more than we do outside of the home. And I never would have thought that would have been true, but statistically speaking, it happens more often than not, especially pulling the trigger inside of your home. And so it's very important. It's just as important that you have the protection inside your home as outside your home, even though the castle doctrine could be there to protect you, even though you don't have a duty to retreat out of your homes in most cases, still it provides you with the presumption that you properly use your firearm as self-defense. But I always remind people that's a rebuttable presumption, and the prosecutor is there to prove that you didn't use your firearm as self-defense and you improperly used self-defense even in your own home, and then everything starts all over again. I've represented many people that have had that incident occur in their home. I just had two actually in the state of Ohio where I was able to be the attorney on the cases. One was in February in Columbus, Ohio, outside a gas station by a food truck, and another one was in a pizza shop in New Carlisle, Ohio. And they both made the NRA Magazine's Armed Citizen, but those were the first two that we've had in 10 years that actually didn't take place in someone's home or around their home.
Wow. Okay, so now you brought up a couple of things here I think are interesting, and one is the idea of a presumption that you did the right thing. In California, we have a castle doctrine law. Basically, it says that there's a presumption that you acted properly if you're in your home and somebody is forcibly entering your home or has forcibly entered your home, and it's not your roommate or whatever. What exactly, some people take that as a guarantee. What exactly is a presumption, and what are the limits of that?
The presumption, Joel, is that at first blush or the first shot, or the first thought that we're going to say that or presume that you did everything properly, that you did everything you had a legal right to do. That's a presumption. But then it's rebuttable in the fact that the prosecutor and the police can investigate the facts, and a prosecutor can look at the facts and realize that, you know what, even though you have the presumption that you did everything you had a legal right to do, you didn't. And I can successfully rebut that because it was a drug deal gone bad in your own house, or something happened and you improperly used a firearm, or you started an incident, within your own home. So it's rebuttable. Even though the presumption is there, it's not an ironclad presumption that we're not going to prosecute you or you're going to be held harmless for whatever you've done.
There's an old saying that an armed society is a polite society. And I think folks tend to take that and look at that from only one direction when they ought to look at it from both. The one direction I hear about that all the time is an armed society is a polite society because the criminals don't know who has guns and don't know who doesn't. And to a degree, that's true. But from an attorney's perspective, how important is it to look at it from the other perspective of an armed society is a polite society? Because if you're armed, you have a lot of responsibility since you could easily take a life. And so it's incumbent upon you to be more polite, to perhaps put up with more offense, to be the person who's the peacemaker rather than the person who is instigating things. Because one of the things you just brought up is that presumption's all fine and dandy until somebody can prove that you started it. Mm-hmm. So how important is it for us as concealed carry holders or law-abiding armed citizens to be the peacemakers and try to avoid conflict?
I think it's probably the most important, one of the most important things to consider. And I've always been an advocate for that. An armed society is a polite society, but the best part of that is we're armed, we're concealed carry holders, we know what we have. We know that we have the power with 5 pounds of pressure to change somebody's life, including your own, forever. So, you don't get in road rage incidents. Someone bumps into you and is drunk and wants to cause some problems, you learn to walk away, because anything you start certainly can be finished in different ways. And I always remind somebody that even when you brandish, if you brandish a firearm, when you pull that firearm out of your purse, out of your waistband holster, now somebody somewhere is in fear of death or serious bodily injury or harm because you just pulled a firearm in your hand. So if you weren't already in fear of death or serious bodily injury or harm, the person that you're pointing that gun at is also. And so now they have just as much of a right as you do to use the affirmative defense, of self-defense, or lethal force. So that's very important to remember. Sure, we all know that the bad guys, and I do seminars on lethal force and the law all over the country. And one thing I always point out is I also represented criminals for going on 30 years. And so I know a lot more than I ever thought I would know about the criminal mind. And I promise you that they didn't get out of bed in the morning expecting to die. And so that's why the threat of the potential of someone having a firearm makes a big difference to them. And it also brings out the fact that they generally plan what's going on, except for this the day and age of the drug abuse, and when people are under the influence of drugs. Certainly, there's not much pre-planning, but prior to that, there are a lot of criminals plan who, where, what, and when something's going to happen. At least generally speaking. But it's very important, Joel, that you remember that you're the good person with a gun, and you have the major responsibility to make sure that you act accordingly, because you've been given a lot of power by the ability to take a life, and you've been given a lot of respect by the society that allows you to carry that power.
We'll get back to the interview with Sean Maloney in a moment. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, Second Call Defense has become a sponsor of GunGuyTV, for which I'm very, very grateful. They're a great company, and they do great stuff. So if you carry a gun or keep a gun for home defense, you'll find yourself with some serious legal battles if you ever have to use it to defend yourself. That's where Second Call Defense comes in. I've used Second Call Defense for years, as I mentioned, and I've recommended it to my students that entire time. There are a lot of options out there, but I urge you, before you decide, check out Second Call Defense. You'll find them by using the link in the description of this podcast, or you can visit my website at GunGuy.tv to find out more. Second Call Defense.
Saving the Second Amendment, one episode at a time. This is the GunGuyTV podcast.
How much foolishness goes with this? And let me frame the question. I generally teach my students. I've been teaching the concealed carry course for the San Diego County Sheriff's Department for more years than I care to count. In that course, I try to impress upon my students that it's incumbent upon you to think first, that a firearm is not a passport for you to go someplace that you wouldn't otherwise go without it. And unless your work takes you there, or you have to go there for some responsibility that you have, you might ask yourself first, would I go there if I didn't have the gun? And if the answer is no, then don't go there. I'm curious, you've been in a lot of these court battles. How many of these court battles happen because somebody goes someplace they probably wouldn't have gone without the gun, but they went because they had it?
That happens more often than you think, and I bet because you asked the question, you either knew that answer or you suspected it. So sometimes that happens, and that's an excellent perception to have on a situation. Just because you have a permit and you're carrying a gun doesn't mean that your life is now suddenly bulletproof, so to speak, protected. You still got to use common sense and think, well, if I want to go here under normal circumstances, why should I go there with a firearm? Because now with a firearm, the tragic things can happen to everybody around you.
Many of the folks that we've seen in the news in the last several years who got involved in shootings were folks who went to things with a gun that they wouldn't have gone to without it. And I've seen those stories multiple times. And the terrifying thing for me is to be that guy. Because earlier you said you can impact someone's life, including your own. So you've done this a lot, even if the shooting was justified, even if you are not prosecuted criminally. How drastically does it affect a citizen's life if they have to defend themselves with a firearm?
There's a couple things to consider. The first thing is the stigma, how you're treated by your friends, your coworkers, and people that either don't really agree with the decision to carry a firearm, or the fact that you had to. And then something more important is internally. And one of my clients that was involved in a shooting a few weeks ago, he did everything he had a legal right to do, and probably without a doubt, if he wouldn't have, he would have been dead. But psychologically and emotionally, he hasn't accepted the fact and can't accept the fact yet that he took a human life. Even though in his mind he knows that that it was him or the other guy, but he just has a hard time dealing with that and accepting that. And one thing that that Second Call Defense offers is psychological counseling, up to 40 sessions with a psychiatrist or a psychologist of your choice. And I did that because over the years as a criminal defense attorney, I've seen the toll that defending yourself or taking another life or severely injuring another person has on people. And some people can't deal with that, and probably everybody needs help, some way to deal with it. So that's kind of one of the untalked about wounds of a self-defense shooting or using lethal force in self-defense is, okay, you've done it, you're alive for the next 40 years. Now, how do you get out of bed every morning knowing that you took a human life? And you're always going to question yourself as a good person with a gun, because that's what we are. Human beings, for the most part, innately are good people. And things like that are going to bother people. And of course, we've seen what happens when that section of society don't care anymore. But for the most part, as a law-abiding citizen that takes another human life, some people can't get over it and probably never will. And that's always a consideration to make, because you hear people at the range, or I see people on websites and then chat rooms and stuff, and the Keyboard Commandos, that they can kill anybody and do anything. I always say, be careful what you wish for, because you got to deal with that.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions I have. You just mentioned something. The Keyboard Commandos. People have a tendency in social media to spout off. I'm in my 60s, okay? So I remember a time when if you were mouthy, you got a fist in your mouth, and then you learned not to be mouthy. The reason I bring it up is because now people feel free to be mouthy like crazy on the internet. Now a person has got a concealed carry permit, or they have a gun at home, and they're mouthy on Facebook, and they're mouthy on Twitter, and they're mouthy here, and they're mouthy there, and they're mouthy the other place, and they spout off and say things because they play too many video games, perhaps. And, I'm not picking on any particular person. I just see it all the time because I'm a YouTuber, okay? Right. So I see it in the comments all the time. And now they get in a defensive shooting. Does that internet behavior come back to haunt them in court?
I wish I could blow up every computer that's on the face of the earth that my clients have.
The answer then is a resounding yes, obviously. Yes, okay.
Because the first thing I do when I get a phone call and I decide to take a case, or before I decide to take a case, I'm on a computer and my admin's doing an internet search. They're looking Facebook, they're looking Twitter, they're everywhere. And because the prosecution is going to do the same things, and I always tell people, be careful what you put out there, because you can never get it back. And to be in front of a jury trying to explain to them that how your client had no choice but to take another human life, there was no opportunity to retreat, and then all of a sudden have the prosecutor stand up with page after page after page of quote unquote badass comments that he's going to take care of business and he's going to kill somebody and you better not mess with me. Almost to the point where you seem predisposed to be doing that. And we all know it's not, but again, whether you're serious or not, you said it, you typed it, and you can't take it back any more than you could take the bullet back.
Well, that's the other thing to remember too. I would suspect as an attorney, you would tell people, and we'll get into this in just a second, don't talk to the police. But one of the problems with talking to the police is, when I was a young cat, police used to write down your comments. Now it's in your voice,
right?
And it's a video of you saying it. And so it's very hard for you to refute something that you said that they can actually play back, and the jury can watch you say it and hear you say it. So it's very, very important that you are very particular about what comes out of your mouth and what you put on the internet.
There is a lot more of this interview available. Unfortunately, I've run out of time for the public part of the podcast, so this is where that part will end, and we'll move right into the exclusive part for GunGuyTV crew members. Now, if you're not a member of the crew, I urge you to sign up today. Go to GunGuyTVcrew.com, and then you'll be able to listen to the rest of it. If you're listening on your public podcast player and you're going to cut out here, then I thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful week, and wherever you go, whatever you do, stay safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuy TV podcast.